As the Red Army marched towards victory, behind the glory and triumph lay a darker tale, one of immense suffering inflicted upon women who found themselves at the mercy of Russian soldiers. Captive women, irrespective of their nationality or allegiance, became victims of widespread and systematic abuse. These acts, ranging from physical brutality to abuse, were not isolated incidents, but a tragic pattern that emerged in the chaos of war. These acts were not only perpetrated against adult women, but also targeted young girls and the elderly. German civilians evacuated their towns and villages as the Red Army swept through the German landscape, fearing what would happen to them if they fell into Russian hands. Those women and girls unfortunate enough to meet the Red Army soldiers often found themselves brutally abused and murdered, whilst those refugee columns that did not meet Soviets on the ground could still find themselves under fire from Russian fighters and bombers in the air. Estimates vary, but it is believed anywhere from 200,000 to 2 million German civilians fell victim to Soviet war crimes. These attacks not only occurred during the war, but also after, during the Soviet occupation. Brutal crimes of the Soviets began long before the Red Army entered German territory, beginning almost a year before the war was even declared. In Latvia, over 10,000 civilians were deported to Siberia. In Estonia, all army officers were executed or exiled, and roughly one-third of the entire population was either arrested, executed, or deported. In Poland, Soviet forces executed 22,000 Polish army officers, and the torture of prisoners was rampant. The Russian Civil War 20 years prior was marked by endless atrocities, and this brutality carried on through to World War II. Both political hatred and a personal need for revenge contributed to these horrific abuses. These crimes were not limited to their enemies. It's estimated that during the Soviet liberation of Serbia, as many as 5,000 Serbian women were victims of sexual violence. The Soviet army suffered greatly when it came to discipline and good leadership, and drunkenness was rampant. In 1936, Stalin had thousands purged from all echelons of society: officers, local party bosses, old Bolsheviks, and more. Stalin was paranoid and feared being overthrown, and even those who had dedicated their lives to the Bolshevik cause were not immune to his paranoia. This purge resulted in anywhere from 700,000 to 1.2 million deaths, either through direct execution or death during deportation, or in the gulags. With many of these casualties being Red Army officers, when World War II began, the USSR was lacking in experienced commanders. Need for revenge. Partially due to the lack of good officers, the Soviets spent the first years of the war suffering defeat after humiliating defeat. The German army launched Operation Barbarossa in 1941, rampaging with immense speed through much of Russia, Ukraine, and Belarus, leaving endless death in its wake. Within the first year, Germany occupied much of the Soviet Union and many had died, both soldiers and civilians. By late 1942, Germany occupied Ukraine, Belarus, and over half of European Russia, ruling over 40% of the Russian population. With this occupation came brutal repression and endless atrocities. Over 5,000 Belarusian settlements were eradicated, their populations exterminated, and the buildings razed to the ground. The Jews of Ukraine and Belarus were systematically exterminated, and civilians under Nazi occupation lived in constant fear of their new overlords. Soviets gained the upper hand. By 1944, after years of intense fighting, the tide had turned for the Red Army. The German advance had been stopped in its tracks. The Soviet army had doubled in size, and its stocks of aircraft and tanks had skyrocketed. While Soviet industry had adapted well to wartime production, it still wasn't enough to equip everyone. This gap was filled by Lend-Lease, a system where America and the UK would loan the USSR equipment to either be returned or paid for at the end of the war. By the end of the war, they had received $11.3 billion in aid, $143 billion today, 11,000 tanks, 15,000 aircraft, 400,000 jeeps and trucks, 15 million pairs of boots, and 4.5 million tons of food. This material aid allowed the Soviets to exploit one of their main strengths: overwhelming manpower. Another crucial factor in the eventual Soviet victory was their effective use of guerrilla warfare. As the Germans advanced deeper into Soviet territory, local partisan groups emerged and operated behind enemy lines, engaging in acts of sabotage, ambushes, and hit-and-run attacks on German supply lines and communication networks. This unconventional approach disrupted German operations and weakened their hold on occupied territories. To combat the guerrillas, the German army and its collaborators carried out reprisal killings. For every partisan attack, the Germans would kill civilians en masse or burn down their villages. These reprisals only served to encourage the partisans to fight on and increased feelings of resentment towards the German people. The harsh Russian winter also played a significant role in hampering the German advance. As temperatures dropped drastically, the freezing conditions posed severe challenges for the German soldiers, who were ill-prepared for such extreme weather. The German army expected a quick victory and did not have enough cold-weather clothes or appropriate supplies to keep their vehicles functioning. The Soviets capitalized on this by launching offensives during winter months when their adversaries were at a disadvantage. Soviet leadership under Joseph Stalin implemented a strategy of scorched earth policy, whereby they destroyed infrastructure and resources as they retreated from advancing German forces. This tactic denied valuable supplies to the enemy while making it difficult for them to maintain control over conquered territories. Belarus was retaken in 1944 after years of intense, bloody fighting. One can only imagine the Soviet soldiers' need for revenge after seeing the bloodshed and terror inflicted on their compatriots by the German invaders. When Belarus was finally liberated, the Red Army found themselves not far from the German border, where they would soon take their bloody revenge. Soviet atrocities in Germany begin. The Soviet atrocities against the German people would begin in October 1944 in the small village of Nemmersdorf. This was the first ethnic German settlement to fall to the advancing Red Army, who were now pushing the Wehrmacht back to Berlin. 74 German civilians were killed, along with 50 French and Belgian POWs. All the women, aged between 8 and 84, had been abused before they were killed. This was only the beginning of a 7-month spree for the Russian soldiers as they made their way through Germany. The Soviet army's entry into Germany would cause widespread panic, with millions of German civilians fleeing their towns and villages, hoping to either reach safety in Berlin or be captured by the Americans or British, who were known for treating prisoners well, both civilians and soldiers. In April of 1945, Soviet forces reached Berlin, with the Soviet Union launching a massive offensive against Nazi Germany's capital city. This brutal battle lasted from April 16th to May 2nd, 1945, and marked the final major military campaign of the European theater. The Soviet forces were driven by a deep sense of anger and revenge after enduring years of devastating losses and atrocities committed by the Nazis on Soviet soil. As they advanced towards Berlin, they were determined to bring an end to Hitler's regime and sought to punish Germany for the millions of civilian deaths caused by German aggression. This punishment would be handed out in much the same way Germany did in Russia. Every German, whether soldier, civilian, man, woman, or child, was seen as guilty and deserving of punishment. Berlin was surrounded by the Soviet army, which had with it over 2 million men, 40,000 artillery pieces, over 6,000 tanks, and 7,500 combat aircraft. By the time the Soviets had reached Berlin, Germany was on its knees. There were shortages of fuel, weapons, soldiers, and food. So desperate was the situation that German civilians were mobilized. The citizen militia, called the Volkssturm, was poorly trained and equipped. It was comprised of elderly men not fit for proper military service and children. Boys and girls as young as 14 were given less than a day's training and sent to combat the incoming Soviet army. The battle itself was marked by intense urban warfare, as Soviet troops fought street by street against well-entrenched German defenders. The city became a scene of widespread destruction as buildings were reduced to rubble and civilian casualties mounted. Post-war abuses. Ultimately, the battle concluded with the capture of Berlin by Soviet forces. This victory symbolized the end of Nazi Germany, though while the war had come to an end, the Red Army's thirst for vengeance had not. In May 1945, Hitler committed suicide, and Germany surrendered. Germany was split into 4 zones controlled by the Allied powers. East Germany was a Soviet occupation zone, and abuses against the population would continue until the winter of 1948, when Soviet soldiers were finally confined to their camps or guard posts, no longer allowed to wander the streets without good reason. Some historians describe the sexual abuses committed by the Soviet army in Germany as the greatest phenomenon of mass abuse in history, believing there to have been 1.4 million cases of abuse in the provinces of East Prussia, Pomerania, and Silesia alone. The threat of violence and lack of food in East Germany during the Soviet occupation immediately after the war meant many women were forced into relations with Soviet officers in order to ensure their own safety and a source of food. The abuses led to as many as 100,000 women obtaining improper abortions, and with an estimated 10,000 dying as a result. Those women who did give birth faced their own problems, as infant mortality rates in the immediate aftermath of the war in Berlin were sometimes as high as 90%. They also risked being ostracized from their families, left to fend for themselves in the rubble of Berlin. These events left deep scars on Germany, and the abuses of the Soviet occupation would not be publicly discussed for decades to come. The victims of these attacks felt immense shame, and any efforts to speak out were usually silenced. East Germany, until it unified with West Germany, was a staunch ally of the Soviet Union, which meant discussions of any Soviet wrongdoing during the war or after were strongly suppressed. The Soviets saw their actions as an eye for an eye, and believed they did to the Germans only what the Germans had done to them earlier in the war. An entire generation of both Russian and German men had been turned into bloodthirsty animals, with hatred and anger rushing through their veins.